everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, or CPBF. CPBF is a charitable organization, and our mission is to empower families of premature babies through support and education. This Preemie Chats series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for NICU families and healthcare professionals. Here every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us their knowledge and experience. Always on our website, canadianpreemies.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. And today, still talk about the World Breastfeeding Week that just happened last week. We're going to talk about human milk for human babies, how breastfeeding shapes infant development. Breast milk is an extraordinary superfood, providing all of the nutrients a baby needs in exactly the right combination. It changes over time as the baby grows and responds to the mother and baby's environment. Breast milk is also the ultimate personalized medicine, providing protection against infections during infancy and lowering the risk of asthma and obesity later in childhood. These incredible properties of breast milk are related to its bioactive components, including live bacteria and specialized sugars that help seed and feed the baby's gut microbiome. Dr. Azad's team is studying how breastfeeding and human milk shape the infant microbiome and contribute to infant growth, child development, and lifelong health. And I have here joining me live Dr. Megan Azad, who is an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at the University of Manitoba, where she holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Developmental Origins of Chronic Disease. Her research program is focused on the role of the infant nutrition and the microbiome in child growth, development, and resilience. Dr. Azad co-directs the new Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center and leads the new International Milk Composition Consortium. She serves as a deputy director of the Child Cohort Study, a national pregnancy cohort following 3,500 children to understand how early life experiences shape lifelong health. Dr. Azad, thank you so much for joining us here today. Such a pleasure to have you here, especially during this month of August when we raise a lot of awareness of the importance of breastfeeding and breast milk.
My pleasure. Thank you, Fabiana, for the introduction and the invitation. I'm excited to speak with you today and to share a little bit about my research on human milk for human babies. So we'll jump right in. My team at the University of Manitoba studies breastfeeding, and this is why. So in some countries in the world, believe it or not, up to 20% of infant deaths are caused by suboptimal breastfeeding. So these are data from 2013 from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And you can see this map of the world is color-coded. Down here, I've highlighted South Africa, which is this bright orange color. So in South Africa, about 17% of infant deaths are attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding. That could be for a variety of reasons. It might be because breastfeeding is known to protect against diarrheal disease. And in some developing countries, that is still a major cause of infant death. So if they're not getting breastfed, they're not being protected against those illnesses. It could be that babies who are not breastfed in these settings have to be fed something else, and they might be receiving formula that's mixed up with water that's not safe to drink. So this isn't something we often think about in a country like Canada, but in many countries in the world, they still don't have regular access to clean drinking water, and that can be a source of infection for babies who are not being breastfed. So there are a variety of reasons why suboptimal breastfeeding might contribute to infant death, and you can see in the map that this primarily occurs in developing countries. But I have here a question mark over the US and Canada. So in countries like ours, we fortunately don't have many infant deaths being attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding, but there are still really a lot of important reasons to breastfeed. So this is a pamphlet that's given out by Manitoba Health in my home province about breastfeeding, and it talks about 8 great reasons to breastfeed your baby. And so we've got on here things like it's convenient, it's the perfect food for babies. It actually helps make moms healthier too, which is an area that doesn't receive enough attention. It's better for the planet, so it's environmentally friendly. It builds love, so bonding between mom and baby, and so on. But I'm going to focus mostly today on the research around breastfeeding and infant health. So the evidence that breastfed babies are healthier. And this is because, for example, in infancy, babies who are breastfed have a 36% lower risk of sudden infant death syndrome. They have a 72% lower risk of respiratory tract infections. Later in childhood, they have a 30% reduced risk of type 1 diabetes. And thinking even later into adolescence and adulthood, they have up to a 30% lower risk of obesity. So there are many short-term and long-term benefits to baby's health and to health later in life. And so this is a great quote that I love. I think it kind of sums up my interest and passion for breastfeeding in one great sentence. It says, human breast milk is not only the perfectly adapted nutritional supply for the infant, but probably the most specific personalized medicine that he or she is likely to receive, given at a time when gene expression is being fine-tuned for life. And this is a quote by Cesar Victoria, who's a researcher that led a really brilliant series of papers in The Lancet in 2016, which I would encourage you to check out if you're stimulated today to learn more about the evidence behind breastfeeding, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective. This is a great collection of papers. And one of the statistics from that series is shown here. So it's been estimated based on the evidence that improving breastfeeding practices worldwide to the optimal levels could save more than 820,000 lives a year. So many of those would be infants. Like I showed you previously on the slide with the map, there are many infant deaths attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding. But some of these lives saved would be mothers too. So mothers who breastfeed have a lower risk, for example, of ovarian cancer and breast cancer later in life, as well as cardiovascular disease. So the reason I love this quote, it talks about breast milk being more than just food. So yes, it's this perfect nutritional supply for babies, but it's much more than that. So breast milk, as I'll show you later, contains many things beyond just nutrients. And so we can think of these as a sort of personalized medicine. It contains factors that protect the baby from infection, for example. And it's personalized because it's adapted to the environment that's shared by the mother who's making the milk and the baby who is drinking it. And also, this is all happening, this breastfeeding, ingestion of nutrition and medicine through milk is happening at this really critical period of development when gene expression, so how genes are expressed, is being fine-tuned for life. So this period of early infancy is when a lot of systems in the body become fine-tuned and sort of set into a trajectory for the rest of your life. So this includes things like your immune system, your metabolism, your brain development. These are all developing early in infancy when breast milk is being received. And as we learn more about breast milk, we're finding out about how its many components contribute to these important developmental practices. So Dr. Victoria, as I mentioned, is an epidemiologist who led this great series of papers. He also did some original research back in the 80s. He was one of the first people to show quite definitively that actually formula-fed babies in his home country of Brazil were at higher risk of diarrheal disease and death as compared to babies who were breastfed. And this was at a time when formula feeding had kind of become quite popular and breastfeeding had fell out of favor. And so it was based on this evidence from Cesar Victoria's team that they started to question whether or not formula was really this perfect alternative to breast milk. And subsequently, many other researchers showed this as well. And so Cesar Victoria actually won a Gairdner Prize in 2017 for his work on the impact of exclusive breastfeeding on infant mortality. And so this image is taken from an announcement of the Gairdner Awards in 2017. Some people refer to these awards as the Baby Nobel Prizes because many of the scientists and researchers that receive this award go on in a few years later to win the Nobel Prize. So it's a pretty big deal. And just to re-emphasize that point, these are some of the other winners from Dr. Victoria's years. So Akira Endo won the award for developing statins, which are widely used medications around the world. Louis Kay won for developing nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, that's a mouthful, so a really important scientific technique. And Rino Rapoli developed the meningococcus B vaccine. So these are really important discoveries, important science, and it made me really excited to see breastfeeding research recognized on the same scale. So this is a second quote from that same series, and this one is by the Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank. And he says, if breastfeeding did not already exist, someone who invented it today would deserve a dual Nobel Prize in medicine and economics. And so having just shown you how Cesar Victoria actually has been recognized with a baby Nobel Prize anyway, I think this is a really fitting quote. And I like that it emphasizes not only the health or medical benefits, but also the economic ones that go with it. And then the final quote I'll share with you before I dive into some science is this one, which is a little bit funny on the surface and then also really concerning and sad when you think about it. And it's true. we actually know more about what's in a strawberry than what's in breast milk. And you could replace strawberry with a lot of things, right? Tomatoes or corn, like because of agriculture and the commercialization of it, we know a lot about other foods because they're economically important. And yet somehow we know relatively little about what's in breast milk, which is like the most important food that a new baby is going to consume. And so it's a real knowledge gap that's starting to be recognized by the scientific community in ways, for example, funding more research into breast milk composition. But this is far later than it should have occurred, I think, in my probably a little biased opinion. But we're learning more, but there is still a lot to learn. And so this really is the impetus behind the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center, or MILK with a C, which is co-directed and co-founded by myself and my colleague Nathan Nickel. So I have a background in epidemiology and human milk science. So I'm a biochemist. I have a degree in genetics. So I'm very interested in the science, the molecules that are in breast milk. Nathan has a degree in public health and biostatistics. And so he's very interested in the health policies around supporting breastfeeding, for example. And so milk has these 4 pillars, which you can see here. So firstly, an infant feeding and lactation database. And so this is where in Manitoba, we're collecting information about how babies are fed when moms are coming in for their routine well baby vaccination visits at when babies are a few months old. And that's really important because until this database was started, we had information about how babies were fed when they left the hospital after they were just born, because that information would be recorded in their hospital record. It would be noted whether the babies were receiving their mother's own milk or they were getting formula, and that would be captured. And we could use that data for certain types of research, but it's pretty limited. After that, we had no idea how the babies were fed. And of course, those first couple days are important, but what happens after is equally important. And so this information was missing, but we're starting an initiative to capture it in Manitoba so that we can then do all sorts of research around how babies are fed and how that is impacted by different policy decisions, by different maternal factors, and how it's linked to infant health as those babies grow up. And then secondly, we have the human milk biorepository. And so this is the part that I'm leading. And so when moms are answering these questions about how they feed their babies, we're also going to ask them if they would like to contribute a sample of their milk for research. And so we're going to do things like measure the different nutrients in the milk, the different non-nutrient components that I'll tell you more about shortly. And then this information, again, can be linked to what we know about the mother's health, what we know about the infant's health, and tracked forward as the babies grow up. In both cases, so this information about infant feeding, the information about human milk is being linked into the Manitoba Population Research Data Repository. And this is a place where in Manitoba, because of our public healthcare system, we have access to the health records of all Manitobans. And so this would include hospital records, physician billing claims, prescription records, and also some social services data. And so this can all be accessed for research purposes. It's de-identified, but it's a really important resource for understanding health in the province and the impact of different policies. And now we're going to link breast milk data into this important resource, which is really exciting and very unique in the world. And then finally, we have our Milk Club. And some of you in the audience might be interested in this. So this is a group of researchers, trainees, clinicians, and healthcare providers that meets once a month. We meet, initially this was a club, sort of an internal club of Manitobans who were interested in breastfeeding and breast milk from different angles. But as we have been inviting different speakers to connect with us, we've had a lot of interest in opening it up more internationally and external to Manitoba. So we are starting to have quarterly meetings that invite people from outside Manitoba to join us for different talks and discussions. And so you can learn more about that at our website. So moving on to some of the science and the interesting facts about milk. Human milk is a superfood. So I mentioned earlier that it's this perfect nutrition. I think it's not an exaggeration to think of milk as a superfood. So I know that's a buzzword lately, superfood, but really if I was going to say this word fit one food, it would be breast milk. And so, you know, it contains all the nutrients that a baby needs, and it's changing over time to meet those needs as they change. We also can think of milk as a baby's first vaccine. So this is particularly topical now during a pandemic where we know that maternal antibodies, for example, to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, if she's been infected and recovered or if she's been vaccinated, those antibodies are going to be put into her milk and the baby can receive them that way, which is really important because babies are too young to be vaccinated themselves. They can receive this protection from their mother. I mentioned human milk as a personalized medicine. So for all of these different immune factors that are in the milk, we can think of it almost as a medicine. And the personalized aspect is important too. So, a baby who lives in a household where the mother or other family members have developed COVID would receive that protection. And that's particularly important for that baby because it's living in a household where it's likely to be exposed. And you can think of similar scenarios for all sorts of other infections. And I like the catchphrase that human milk is tailor-made for tiny humans. And that's because milk is different for different species, which is the focus of this slide. So milk is different from formula. Milk is different for humans than from any other species. And so you can see here an example of a human baby and a cow baby or a calf. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to see a calf be born. But within literally moments, they are getting up and sort of wobbling around. Where if you contrast that to a human baby is not going to be wobbling around or crawling or walking for many months. It's actually going to spend a lot of time sleeping, and that's because it's devoting its energy to brain development rather than muscle development and movement. And so that's one example of how these two species have very different needs. And so their milk is very different. Because, of course, all mammals have mammary glands and make milk. That's actually why they're called mammals. But the milk is very different for these different species because of these different needs. And formula is actually made from cow's milk. So the components in it, although it's, of course, modified to try and make it closer and closer to human milk, is really not the same and is ideally optimized for a cow before it gets processed. So you can see here, and I'm sure can't read all the little words, but there's a lot of things in breast milk that simply are not found in formula. Milk also differs between species. So I mentioned cows and humans as one example, but it's fascinating to read about milk from other species. For example, seals. Seal milk has the highest fat content of any mammal. And that's because seals are born on like an ice floe. And then they have about a day to drink as much milk as they can to fatten up. And then they get tossed into the freezing cold ocean water. So the fat in seal milk is super high to help them with that. Sorry, I'm not sure. My slides are going a little backwards. Milk also differs between mothers, which is really interesting. And so it's different between species, but not all human milk is the same from mother to mother. So it's going to be different based on that own mother's genetics and based on her environment. So it's highly personalized, as I mentioned. And then we have within mothers. So milk is also different within mothers because it changes over time from month to month, also from morning to night, and even within each feeding. And so this is because over time, month to month, the baby is growing, its needs are going to change. And morning to night is really interesting. So the milk produced in the morning is going to be different compositionally from the milk produced at night. Night milk, for example, is going to have higher levels of molecules that help induce sleepiness. And so you can imagine that in formula, which is sort of one size fits all, it's the same every time. It's not changing. There's not morning formula and night formula. There's not 1 month, 2 month, 3 month formula. It's all the same. And so that's very different from what a baby received if it was breastfed. And even within each feeding, the milk changes. So it's lower in fat content at the beginning of the feed and higher in fat content at the end. And that's thought to help the babies regulate their appetite signaling. So these are all fascinating things about how milk is when it comes fresh from the breast. And so this is another version of the image that you just saw, but with bigger words. And so you can see here that formula, as compared to breast milk, contains all of the main building blocks, the primary building blocks that a baby needs nutritionally. So that would be macronutrients. We have fat, proteins, and carbohydrates, and then micronutrients, which is things like minerals and vitamins. But then what you see is on top of that, breast milk contains so many other things. So this includes growth factors and enzymes and hormones and antibodies, which we've talked about already. And so these are all things that aren't going to be found in a formula. They're pretty unique to human milk. And then this figure is probably a little bit out of date in that it doesn't include some of my very favorite components. So probiotic bacteria, these are live bacteria that are beneficial and healthy. These are naturally found in breast milk. Prebiotic oligosaccharides. So prebiotics are food for beneficial bacteria. So you might read about probiotics in yogurt or other healthy foods. You can also buy probiotic supplements. And here we go, milk contains it naturally as a component. And then something I won't talk about anymore today, but is very fascinating. Milk contains stem cells. So these are cells from the mother that make their way into the baby and integrate into the baby's tissues and presumably play important roles in development. And then food antigens. So this is interesting from an allergy perspective about how food allergies develop and could be maybe prevented by exposure to these food antigens in mother's milk. So a few more words about the pro and prebiotics, because this is one of my main areas of interest in terms of the microbiome, is that milk contains both probiotics, which are live beneficial bacteria, and prebiotics, which are non-digestible carbohydrates that feed those beneficial bacteria. So often we call these fiber. So when we consume fiber, those are carbohydrates that we can't digest on our own, but our gut bacteria digest them for us. And so it's pretty interesting that human milk, breast milk, contains naturally both probiotics and prebiotics. So in that case, I would say there's probably actually 9 great reasons to breastfeed your baby, not just 8. And that 9th reason would be related to the microbiome. So these are 2 famous studies that were published about the baby's microbiome and the importance of breastfeeding. So the microbiome refers to all these bacteria that live in and on our bodies, mostly doing things that help keep us healthy. And so this is a paper that I was part of back in 2013, where we analyzed the microbiome of babies and showed the importance of breastfeeding. And then this was a separate study a few years later that was much larger. And this is my favorite graph from that paper, where they showed that among all these different factors that they studied, so things like antibiotics and vitamin D and maternal body mass index, breast milk was clearly the most important factor shaping the baby's microbiome in the first months of life. And so why is the microbiome important? Well, as I mentioned, these microbes do many important things for us. So they, for example, help us extract energy from food. So those prebiotics, they help us digest. They produce some essential vitamins that we can't produce on our own. They help regulate our immune system, which is especially important in very young babies when their immune system is still developing. They also can help regulate glucose levels and metabolism and so on. And actually, we have 100 trillion microbes living in our body approximately, which is 10 times more bacterial cells than we have human cells. So when you think of just how many there are, it really brings home the point that they must be doing something very important. And so then to know that breast milk is so important for the microbiome really made me think that it was important to understand more about breastfeeding and breast milk and what's in it and how it shapes the microbiome. So that led me to study the microbiome of breast milk. And so it was thought until about 10 or 15 years ago that human breast milk would be sterile unless a mother had an infection. But we now know that actually that is not true. And milk from healthy mothers contains lots of bacteria, enough that babies who are breastfed are consuming up to 10 million bacteria a day. One thing that we still don't know for sure, which is why there's a question mark here, is whether these bacteria in milk are an actual source of gut bacteria. So are they just kind of passing through the baby's intestinal tract and they could be performing important functions while they do that? Or are they actually colonizing the baby's gut? That's something that we're still studying. But here what you can see is that just like I mentioned, milk in general is very personalized. So is the milk microbiome. So here is data from 400 mothers in the child study that we profiled. And these different colors represent different bacteria. And what you can see here is that each column is a mother. And if you look at the one on the left side, she's got almost all orange bacteria, where the one on the right side has got almost all red bacteria. And there's everything in between. So it's very highly personalized, very different from mother to mother. And so we're still doing research to understand why is it so different? What's driving these differences? How is that difference important to the baby? And so on. But it's a really fascinating area of research. So then if we think about those prebiotics, this is a little graphic showing that if you think about milk, it's about 90% water. If you think just about the non-water components or the solid components, we can divide those into macro and micronutrients. The most abundant is lactose, which is a very simple sugar. And then we have fats or lipids. And then actually even more abundant than proteins in milk, which are of course very important, we have what's called HMOs or human milk oligosaccharides. And these are important. These are the prebiotics that I was talking about. And if we just look at them, there are many different types. This figure shows 10 and then says other more longer ones. There's actually more than 100. And if we focus just on those HMOs, these are complex carbohydrates. So they're sugar molecules, essentially, chains of sugar molecules, but they're complex. So the human baby can't actually digest them. They're not found in most baby formulas. Some formulas are starting to add a few of these HMOs, recognizing that they're very important. But for the most part, they're not present in formula. And we now know that they're digested by bacteria, not by babies. So the baby can't digest these HMOs, but the baby's bacteria are digesting them. And that's important. And we also know that they're very species specific. So whereas I mentioned humans make over 100 different HMOs, we know that mice only make 2 and cows make around 40. So this is one aspect of milk that is very different among species. Earlier, I talked about the fat composition and how seal milk is very high in fat. So HMOs are another component, or MOs, milk oligosaccharides, are another component that's very different across different species. So I mentioned earlier that breast milk is a superfood for babies, but I didn't want to leave you today without presenting some other interesting facts that I think are really exciting about breast milk. So it's not only for babies. There's some really interesting research, for example, looking at breast milk and its application outside of infancy. So this is a really neat study where they're using breast milk to treat individuals, these could be adults or children, who received a bone marrow transplant. And the reason they're doing this is because before you get a bone marrow transplant, you essentially have to wipe out your immune system. And that's important because if you don't do that, then your immune system recognizes this new bone marrow from another person as foreign and will just reject it. So they wipe out the immune system before the transplant. But of course, that's very dangerous to wipe out your immune system. And there are a lot of side effects that go along with that. And after the transplant has taken, you want to then ramp back up your immune system. So somebody had the idea that, well, babies essentially have no immune system when they're born, and they rely on breast milk for this immunity while they're developing their immune system. So might it be helpful to give breast milk to adults who've had their immune systems wiped out because of this transplant? And they're finding some really promising results. So I think that's just a fascinating example of how what we learn about human milk can be applied to not just help babies, but people in all sorts of different situations. Another example of an interesting study applying milk science to other conditions is this one, where they're using human milk oligosaccharides, so the HMOs that I talked about, to treat irritable bowel syndrome patients, and finding that this helps restore their microbiome to a healthy state, which can help with their symptoms. So another neat example. And then I also wanted to say a few more words about breast milk as a vaccine, because of course we're in a pandemic and vaccines are on everyone's mind. So I think it's really interesting to talk about this research around COVID and breastfeeding and vaccines. So initially in the pandemic, there was a really quick call to action among breastfeeding researchers where we wanted to very quickly determine if the virus was passed in milk, because there was initially a reaction that maybe moms with COVID shouldn't be breastfeeding, maybe they might be infecting their children through breast milk. And so quite quickly, researchers around the world were able to get some samples, analyze them, and realize that there's no live virus in breast milk. So breastfed babies are not going to be infected by their mothers. And in fact, what's more is there is protective antibodies in the milk of mothers who've had COVID-19. So it's particularly beneficial for them to be breastfeeding their baby with appropriate precautions. So wearing a mask, for example, to avoid infecting through other means. But that was a really important research to do. And this is also true not only of moms who have COVID, but once a mom's been vaccinated, she's again producing antibodies that are passed through her milk. And that's, for many babies, the only way they can receive a so-called vaccination, because they're not old enough to get a vaccination themselves. And so the WHO and other organizations very quickly made recommendations to clarify that moms should breastfeed even if they have COVID-19. And then, finally, I think there's some really neat research going on about whether breast milk could actually be a treatment for COVID. So for people who've already developed COVID, if they need antibodies, you'll probably recall there's been some research on convalescent plasma. So this is blood products from people who've recovered from COVID being sort of harvested and used to treat other people with COVID. There's also the idea that maybe we could do this from milk. And if it works, that would actually be a lot more maybe convenient than taking blood. A person can only give so much blood before they run out, but they can produce a lot more milk. And so if there was a efficient way to harvest COVID antibodies from milk, that might be a new way of treating the condition. So finally, because I know this is the Preemie network, I wanted to mention a study that we have going on in preterm babies. This is a study happening primarily in Calgary with my postdoc, Marilee Brockway, who I think will be also speaking to you this week. And then Jeanette Festival at the Northern Star Mother's Milk Bank, and our collaborator, Claire Arietta. And so what we're doing here is a study to see if we can improve the way that donor human milk is given to premature babies who need it. And essentially, our idea is that there might be a better way to match donor milk to recipient infants. So if you take the analogy of blood donations, we would never take blood donated from multiple people and mix it all together and then give it out to all the recipients. Rather, we figure out the blood type of each donor and match it to the blood type of each recipient. And so we're thinking of doing something similar with milk to see if we can make the outcomes for babies even better than they already are when they receive donor milk. So with that, I wanted to flag that we have a resources page on our milk website. So the link is here. And so I've kind of pulled together a lot of my favorite infographics and education materials and videos. Some, although not most of them, some are generated by our lab, but most are just from other places, but they're resources that I've really liked. So you're welcome to visit the website there. And then I have a little video to show you that summarizes some of our work. And so I'm going to hit play and hope that it works.
Researchers from the child cohort study invited thousands of expecting parents to join a unique Canadian research project. The researchers hope to better understand how a baby's genes and environment influence its health and development through childhood and later life. Nearly 3,500 families agreed to participate. By following the lives of the babies and their parents over many years, the child cohort study has made many exciting discoveries about factors that influence the development of childhood asthma, allergies, obesity, and other chronic diseases. One of these factors is breastfeeding, which benefits babies in many ways. Child research has shown
All right, great. So this video is available. You can see the link there. It's free. It's on YouTube. We're happy for you to share it with anyone who might benefit. We also have on the Child Study website a page for summarizing the discoveries from the study. And this involves many different topic areas. So you can see here, allergies, asthma. I'm pretty proud that the breastfeeding section is, I think, the biggest section. And so you can visit that website to get summaries of the different studies that we've done. This is an example of what you'll find. So some summaries in lay terms of the results, some infographics that are free to download and share. And so we really want this research to be shared. So please feel free to check those out and to share them around. And so with that, I will close off. I'm happy to take questions and chat. And this is where you can find me on Twitter, on the web. And I want to also acknowledge the many people on my research team and from the Child Study and our funders as well that have contributed to the research I shared with you today. So thank you very much.
Dr. Azad, thank you so much for your presentation. Oh my God, I learned so much from you. Every time you speak, there's something new and interesting and exciting happening in the human milk research field. Well, I have quite a few questions for you. Well, based on all that you present, my question is, are we educating parents enough about the importance of breast milk, not only for when is a baby, but thinking about the life cycle of the child? But are we also educating enough healthcare professionals to promote breastfeeding? Because I feel that during the pandemic, and this is what we heard from a lot of parents, there was a lot of rush for babies to get discharged from the hospital and just bottle the baby, give formula to babies because they can get out of the hospital faster. So I want to hear from you. What are your insights and your perspective on that?
Well, I think you make an important point. So it's important to educate, honestly, everyone about breastfeeding. So that includes parents, it includes healthcare providers, includes society as a whole. We often say breastfeeding is a societal responsibility. So I think too often it gets put all on the poor mother's shoulders. But really, it takes a village. So for a mom who wants to breastfeed, like that's step one, educate people, and so that mothers will then know the benefits of breastfeeding and make that informed decision. But there's strong evidence, a lot of women, mothers who want to breastfeed don't meet their own breastfeeding goals, meaning that they stop earlier than they planned. And that's usually for societal reasons. So they don't have the support they need at home, from their doctor, from society. They have to go back to work. People look at them funny if they're breastfeeding in the park. So I think for that reason, it's really important to think about all aspects. And when it comes to healthcare providers, that's a really important one. There actually isn't a specialty in medicine for lactation, which is outrageous when you really think of it, right? There's specialists for brains and specialists for hearts and lungs and kidneys and every other function of the body, but there's not a specialist for lactation. So that's something that I think needs to change, and I think will in the coming years, but is long overdue. But even just training, general practitioners, there's no mandatory section in medical school about breast milk and the benefits of it. I actually had an experience trying to convince the medical school at my university that this should be included. And we were initially told, oh, don't worry, we've covered that. We have a lecture on breast cancer. And go, okay, that's good, but not what breasts were intended for and not covering the importance of lactation. So I do think it's really important that healthcare providers get this information so that they're aware, they're part of the team in promoting breastfeeding, and also so that they're positioned to support moms who are having trouble with lactation. And that might involve referring a mom to another specialist, but at least having that knowledge. And when it comes to parents, I do think there's an awareness that needs to be there, and it really should come long before they've had the baby, because once you've had a baby, especially a premature baby, that's a very stressful time. So to just be learning then that, oh, I should really be breastfeeding, like that's too late. So I know there are prenatal care classes that teach about breastfeeding. That's really good. But even that, I think, is later than it should be. So we actually have a project where we're trying to work with schools to teach children about breastfeeding when they're quite young, because a lot of the beliefs we grow up with are entrenched very early. So I think the earlier we can teach children that this is just how babies eat, then they'll grow up knowing that that's important, and embedding it in things like science class, because there's really interesting science around breastfeeding is one of our goals as well.
Wow, absolutely. And this is how we're going to change our cultures in general, right? Educating the young people. This is normalized what it should be really normal forever. But Let's talk about the preterm population, because there's a lot of elements on your presentation that I'm thinking, okay, we always promote breastfeeding, breast milk for premature babies. There's so much research, so much evidence on the benefits on the short-term and long-term impact on the babies. But we also mentioned about, let me look at my notes, on the microbiome. If the mom is pumping the ICU and the milk is pasteurized, do we lose those properties? And if we do, can we recover some of the loss that we might have in the ICU when the babies go home on a full breastfeed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about donor milk, which is from a milk bank, it has been pasteurized. And the purpose of pasteurizing is to make sure it's safe and that there's no pathogenic bacteria or viruses. And so that, unfortunately, will also kill any good bacteria. So we are losing some of the benefits of milk by pasteurizing it. This processing, which is a heat treatment, can also denature some of the important enzymes in milk. But that said, there are still a lot of components of milk that withstand pasteurization. And HMOs are a great example of that. So those prebiotic complex carbohydrates, they are not affected by pasteurization. So donor milk still contains a fully active complement of HMOs. So that's why, fresh mother's milk would be option number one. And then second below that would be pumped mother's own milk, because if a mom pumps her own milk, keeps it in the fridge or the freezer, and then feeds it to a baby, it hasn't then gone through pasteurization. It still will lose some of its bioactives. Some components are sensitive to freezing, some are sensitive to light. So that's why we're still trying to research what are the best ways to collect milk and store it before you feed it to your baby. But then below that, if you don't have your own milk to pump, would be donor milk, which because of pasteurization, as you pointed out, has lost some of its benefits. And then below that, way below that, would be formula, because it doesn't even have many of these components. But we are doing research. You talked about, could we recover some of these things? So there's some interesting research, for example, on could we take donor milk, which has been pasteurized, and could we add a little bit, because some moms might be making just a little bit of milk, not enough to really feed their baby, but like a few drops even, add that into the donor milk and sort of incubate it so that the microbes could grow. So this is still at a very exploratory phase, but that's something that might be possible.
Wow, that is incredible. So let's talk about the freezing process, because a lot of families ask us about the freezing. When you pump, you freeze. Do we lose in a period of time? Do we lose more if the milk is frozen for longer? And also, are the NICUs changing the culture of giving more fresh milk to the parents, to the baby? Because I remember when I was in the NICU, I pumped and it was frozen by the NICU and then defrost and gave it to my baby. So there was I felt there was so many steps. Do we still do those many steps?
So this is an area of active research. So I believe there are some studies going on to look at if we can keep the milk fresh, like does that have an added benefit that's worth the extra work to do that? So that's something that's being researched. But we have found in full-term babies, and the video alluded to this a little bit, we've found, for example, if babies are breastfed, they have a lower risk of asthma than if they were formula fed. But somewhere in between that is babies that are getting breast milk but pumped. And so it suggests to us that there's something about the pumped milk that is not quite as good as fresh milk directly from the breast, and so it might be something about the storage process. But it also might be something about the process of feeding at the breast, like that skin-to-skin contact, sort of the interaction between the mother and the baby. So we really want to do more research to understand that, because if it is about the freezing of the milk, then maybe there's something better we can do, right? Keep it fresh or freeze it in different ways, different containers. If it's more about that skin-to-skin interaction, then we can promote that. And actually, even if babies have to receive formula, they can still have skin-to-skin contact. So those are really important questions that we don't have all the answers to, but that we're exploring for sure.
But the bottom line is breast milk is best, is the superfood, the first vaccine. So especially for preterm babies. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits for the preterm babies? Because we do a lot of education for families, for healthcare professionals, and it seems that we still have so much room for improvement so parents can understand and healthcare professionals can promote.
Yeah, so breast milk's important for all babies, but as you say, especially for premature babies, because they are born so premature, their immune system is premature, their microbiome is premature. And milk really supports all of these things in a way that's especially important for these vulnerable preterm babies. And that's why human donor milk is prioritized for these babies because it's going to make the biggest impact for them. So if a full-term baby is born and the mom isn't able to produce milk, they're not really prioritized to receive donor milk, just because there isn't enough to go around. That donor milk is going to be prioritized for premature babies because it's so important to them, which emphasizes why it's so important to get their mother's own milk if at all possible. And even there's some interesting research around, they call it oral immune therapy, where this is, the baby might not even be old enough to really be ingesting milk, or the mom might not be making enough milk to really fully feed the baby, but they'll still take a little bit on a Q-tip and kind of rub it around inside the baby's mouth just to get that exposure, because there are so many important things, growth factors, antibodies in that milk that are important for the baby's development. So it's crucial. There's really strong evidence that breast milk prevents necrotizing enterocolitis, which can be a very devastating disease for premature infants. We're still understanding how and why it is so protective, and there's some good data that the HMOs are part of that, and that particular HMOs seem to be preventing against NEC. And so as we learn more about that, maybe we'll be able to generate supplements of those specific HMOs to give to babies if their moms aren't able to make milk. But the more we learn, the more we can sort of develop new treatments to help all of the babies ultimately.
Wow, that is incredible. Before you wrap it up, can you touch a little bit on this incredible research that you're doing with Mary Lee Brockway and the Northern Star? I forgot her name. Let me look at my notes here. I have notes everywhere because there's so many pieces of good information. Janet, tell us a little bit about that. Where are you in the study to match the donors to the babies based on the type of milk? I don't know how you call it now. It's not the blood type, it's the milk type. It's going to have a classification.
Yeah, so it's a really exciting study. We are finally going to be recruiting our first babies this summer. So this study was supposed to start in March 2020. So we all know what happened then. We put everything on hold for a while, but we're ready to get going again. And so the premise of this study is that we know milk is so personalized and different between mothers. And so it just seems very basic to mix milk together and give it to everyone. Like there's probably we believe it's important that milk from a mother is matched to its baby. So could we do a better job of matching even in the case of donor milk? And there are many aspects you could think about. So I talked earlier about, morning milk and night milk. So should we have our milk donors mark their packages like this was my morning milk, this is my night milk, and match it in time sense? There are some differences in milk based on the sex or gender of the baby, which is really fascinating. So, should we get donor moms to say, I have a daughter, I have a son, and like give milk matched in that way? What we thought the first most important thing to match on is what's called secretor status. So this is a genetic trait. So every person, not just mothers, is either a secretor or a non-secretor based on this one gene, one letter in one gene. And if you're a non-secretor, this affects all the sugars that coat your blood cells, your gut cells, but also the sugars that you make in your milk. And so moms who are non-secretors are missing certain HMOs in their milk. And we think that maybe it's better for babies to receive a milk that's matched in secretor status to their own mother, because they would have been sort of primed to receive that. Because although they're called human milk oligosaccharides, they are actually present not just in milk, but recent research has shown that these milk oligosaccharides are found even in amniotic fluid. So the baby is like ingesting them as a fetus, even before it's born. So maybe it's used to this certain HMO profile, and then it gets born, and then it would normally get milk with the same HMO profile. But in the case of donor milk, it's getting something completely different. So should we try and make it as close as possible? So that's what we're doing in this study. We are taking a saliva sample from the mom to determine her secretor type based on her genes. And then we, at the milk bank, have separated the milk into batches that's from secretor moms and non-secretor moms. So we have two types of milk, and then we'll give it to babies based on their mother's own type and see if that's helpful.
Wow, that is fascinating. I can't wait to hear the results of that study. I'm hoping we're still going to have time during our live sessions to present these results, because it's fascinating and for sure is a breakthrough research in the world. But Dr. Azad, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's always so great to hear from you and learn from all your amazing work.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and happy World Breastfeeding Week.
Thank you. And to all of you watching us today, thank you so much. You can watch the video of today's session, all the videos from our live sessions on our YouTube channel or our website, which is right here, the Canadian Preemies.org. And I want to thank our sponsors, AstraZeneca and Medela, for their ongoing support of our educational sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through support and education, we can empower families, ensuring they're ready to care for their babies. Please visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And we'll see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time.